Headline-wise, our presentation may seem a little bit off-topic because now we're turning to how we measure things and how we make indicator schemes. But really, when we look into what we have done or what we have written about, it's actually more about perhaps providing a structure for the things that we have been talking about earlier. So if you listen carefully or read our paper, you will find a room in what we say, for example, concerning the effects that coordination between the different bicycle sharing schemes in Tokyo had, and what Roland was saying about that bicycle train. The combination is much more than about providing bicycle parkings, and also for Jalin when she was there she is when she was talking about the neglectance of coordination of land use and rail, and what the negative effects of that had. So we're going to talk about indicators for integration of public transport, but we're also going to talk about integrated public transport as such. And us, just a short presentation.
My name is Zsuzsanna Olofsson, and I have a background in traffic modeling with the road safety analysis. And in the last 5 years I worked with sustainability and sustainability indicators. Right now, and just 3 weeks ago, I started to work for Trondheim municipality in Norway. It's a small city in the northern part of Norway. But before that, and a big part of the work, I would say the tool that we use as a case study is developed at Lund University in Sweden. There we work together with Karin.
And I'm Karin Brundell-Freij. I'm also affiliated to the same university, and I'm also a consultant with WSP Sweden. And my background is also in traffic modeling, transport economy, and public transport. So we're going to talk about the project, and by the project now we mean about the research that we did for this paper. We're going to talk about integrated public transport, as I said, and provide a structure for that, and discuss a lot what we mean by integrated public transport, what we do when we integrate public transport, why we do it, and what we achieve by doing it. We're going to talk about how you can monitor progress. Generally, with indicators, we're going to give a brief introduction to a specific case of such indicator schemes. There are many, as you know. We're going to talk about what aspects of that scheme could be transferred to the monitoring of integrated public transport. We are going to finalize our presentation with a short discussion about the pros and cons of what we have found. So what we have done now is that we have looked into the possibility of monitoring integration of public transport. And that's something that we did for this specific meeting. So that's not something, a research project that we did before. We did that, we've looked into literature. So this is the theoretical paper. We haven't set up a proper monitoring scheme. So it's not a complete tool, it's just a structure for a tool, it's some important components of a tool. And we talk about conventional public transport, but we also mean that the same structure can be applied also to other types of public transport, perhaps upcoming types with more demand-responsive systems, for example, or automated systems. So what is public transport and integration? And this may be a little bit late, of course, to talk about this on the second day of a roundtable. But we're doing this from a conceptual side now. So the whole basis for there being such a thing as integrated public transport is the fact that public transport can be seen as consisting of parts. And that can be very many parts. I think someone mentioned yesterday that just ordinary transfer points between lines, that's also some kind of integration problem. So there's lines, there's modes, different modes, there's trams and buses, for example. Sometimes there's different organizations within the mode. So here in Tokyo, for example, there are several metro companies. And since there are parts, there can be barriers between those parts, and there can be potential synergies when you cooperate between parts and that are not exploited. So integration between parts, so if you integrate between parts, if you remove barriers or exploit synergies, that can work on either the demand side or the supply side of the system. So it can work on the demand side, and that's what we've been talking about mostly, by providing a better service for customers. But it can also work on the supply side because it can reduce costs for operators. And of course, if you reduce the cost on the operator side, that can then be transferred to benefit on the user side because you can provide more services for the same money. When we looked into the literature first and read a lot, we spent the first time reading a lot about integrated public transport, and what we found out was that it's a rather diverse concept, you could say. You discuss integration in many different ways. And our way of trying to describe in which ways public transport can be integrated is that this structure by what we call layers. So there's a process, a planning process, an organizational process that can be more or less integrated. So companies, for example, different companies can cooperate, they can discuss with each other, or they may not discuss with each other. And then there's the system. The system can be more or less integrated. So if we have integrated planning, we can perhaps achieve an integrated system. And that is consisting of things like change hubs where you can change between lines, bicycle parkings close to stations, fare systems that are integrated and things like that. And often when we talk about public transport integration, we talk about this level. But to achieve this level, we really have to have this level. So it has to be some kind of process. There have to be some people that talk to each other and think and have a common vision of where we are going. But why do we do this system? Why do we do integration? That is to provide quality for passengers. So it's not really the system that's important, it's the quality for passengers. And the reason that we do that is that because we want them to use the system more or with a higher quality. So we also put some other arrows here. So this is the effects that if we have a planning process, we can achieve a better system which can provide quality, which can improve use. The arrows that we have here are the many other factors that are outside the integration and also perhaps often outside our control that affect these things. So we cannot determine the level of use by how much integration we do. We can just affect it a bit. So that's those arrows. There's also feedback loops here, which are very important, because use affects the quality of the system. There's aspects of that that are well known in transport economy, for example, the mooring effect, which means that if you have more passengers, you can provide better standard for the same money, or per passenger. So that's one effect, but it's also because usage is one of the best ways of advertising and marketing a system, so people talk to each other. So if people start to use the system, they will affect each other. There's also another aspect to think about here. The fact that there are so many exogenous factors that are affects the way we can monitor things. We will come back to monitoring, but we can already here say that we cannot, if we're doing integration efforts, it's not feasible to just try to monitor those by looking at the use level, because there are so many things that affect use that are not dealing with integration. So we have to monitor both what we do and also the effects that it has. On each of those levels, so this is a very multidimensional thing, because on each of those levels there are, of course, many aspects. we've discussed something that we call the impacts, that is the overall, what do we achieve on each level. We've talked about the elements, that is the parts that can be affected. And we talk about the measures, and that's important, of course, that's what can we do on each level. So if we want to improve the system, what can we do? Which parts can we deal with? And what will be the impacts? So for the impacts, we've used terms that are available in literature, so we did not invent them. And they've already been criticized, because yesterday Peter mentioned that he doesn't like accessibility being used this way, because it's, I know, because we had the same discussion in Sweden for a rather long time. I think that now that's been solved, because the accessibility for disabled or function impaired, it's now more called micro level or micro scale accessibility. So we have like ridership for the use. We have connectivity, because that's a term that's been used in literature. And I think that when I started to read here, one of the difficult things for me was to understand what is the difference between connectivity in literature and accessibility. And I think an important difference here is that connectivity is a purely within system property, whereas accessibility is something that has to do with the system in relation to land use and activity patterns. So connectivity is how the system works in itself, and accessibility how well it provides for activity patterns that people would want to do. And then for the process part, we call that cooperation. So, and then we have, as I said, elements and measures within each of those. And perhaps the easiest level to start with, if we want to describe what we mean with elements, is the system. So if we want to describe the public transport system and look at whether it's integrated and discuss how we can make it more integrated, it's natural to talk about the network, which is sort of the physical structure that you can show on maps. It is whether hubs are well located together. It is whether bicycle parkings are close to station entrances. And then we have the traffic. That's, for example, coordinated timetables. And then we have the other parts of the service offers, such as fares, for example, such as travel planners. Is that integrated or not? Do we have information on the same kind of platform available so that we can evaluate different parts of the system in parallel? But also in the other levels, there are layers that can be different elements. For example, when we talk on this process level, there's organization, formal organization. There's whether companies are owned together, whether they have a common goal, whether they are, how they are financed, whether it's possible to move money from one part to another. But then there's also those softer issues that have to do with information flow. So do they talk with each other? And do they communicate around what they want to achieve and how they can achieve it? Also on more informal grounds. And I think that here I use this opportunity to advertise for now a rather old thesis that I think I too rarely hear discussed in the traffic planning society, and that's a thesis from Berkeley, and it's now 20 or 30 years old, something like that, but it's in political science, but it is about traffic planning. It's called Cooperation Without Hierarchy, and it's about how public transport planning occurs in the Bay Area, where there's no formal organization that cooperates, but where there's a lot of cooperation that's very informal but works very well on the informal level. But it's not only the system that can be described and the process that can be described, it's also Accessibility, of course, that can be described from a destination level, so does this destination have a good accessibility, or on a relation level, as that on the OD relations. And then there's, of course, measures. So there's measures you can do. You can take. You take a measure. Different kind of measures you can take on these different steps, on these different layers. So you can work with land use here, and you can work with the timetables, and you can decide to have more cooperation. So you can do things to try to improve integration on those different layers. So to make all these, which is a bit wordy, and also perhaps a bit theoretical and conceptual, to make it a bit more concrete, we relate it to the discussion of integration of bikes into the public transport system, which is what we talked a lot about, both yesterday and today. So if we look at the process layer, what happens here is when bike planners and public transport providers start to talk with each other. Perhaps they are co-organized, but also that they create networks where they start to talk to each other, so that they share both vision, terminology, understanding of how those things works. Then on the system level, what can happen? Well, for example, we could introduce so that bike sharing system can be paid with your public transport card. That's part of that's a part of the system that we call the service. But you can also locate public or bike parking so that they are the closest ones to the public transport entrances, the metro entrances. That's the element of the system that we call the network. So there's something you can do. But you can actually also do things up here where you affect accessibility in other ways than by you working with the connectivity. That's, for example, if you already have locations where there is good integration of bike and public transport, and then you have other locations where the integration might not be so good. If you use those locations where the integration is good and locate attractive services there, you can do that by land use planning. It may be things that is in your hand as a public, like a municipal, some kind of municipal service or so. If you choose to locate that in the place where there's already a close connection between bike and public transport, then you've improved accessibility and affected it through the integration of public transport, although you didn't do anything with the public transport system yours in itself. So are there anything you can do with ridership without affecting those lower layers? Well, here it's a bit more difficult to think of, but perhaps here you could find campaigns, for example. If you inform about the things that you have already provided for, then you're affecting use. So now we go over to the monitoring. This was about understanding what integration is. Now we go over to monitoring. So the first step, if you do a monitoring system, that is to understand the process. So you understand what it is that you're monitoring. That's what we've been working with in the presentation until now. Then after that, you have to define the target group. So whom are you monitoring for? Who will use this as a feedback into their process? And here we are very vague in our work here, because we haven't really discussed any specific target group. It's very anonymous, which also sets limitations for how far we can go. It's also to understand sort of the the context, I would say. Like how much resources would be available for data collection, what kind of channels are there already for data collection. And once that has been done, then once that has been done, you can go further into the detailed work of defining indicators, measurement methods, etc., frameworks, detailed frameworks. So this is a rather tedious project, or process, and it has been done in many different places. So in particular in relation to sustainability, this issue of how do you set up a monitoring system has been worked with a lot. And what we draw from a lot is the work that Zsuzsanna and colleagues, me only very remotely, did on the transport sustainability barometer. This is not the only system for monitoring sustainability, but it's a system that was developed together with close cooperation with municipalities, and where they identified a structure with different aspects that all related to the three pillars of sustainability. So there's livability, for example, and there's a lot of different aspects that relate. It's not only the three pillars, but it's things that relate to the three pillars. And there's three levels. So the input level is what you do. It's the measures you take. The output level is sort of a middle level. The outcome level is what we want to achieve. So that's the big words that politicians talk about when they set up visions for sustainability. The output level is in the middle and is a level on which the officers who are working down here with the details and the politicians can meet and communicate. An important part of the TSB is also how it's visualized. The results are visualized as progress indicators that show progress towards a vision. So 100%, that's when you achieve your vision, and then you sort of measure in relation to that. Another important aspect is the duality between the objective measurements and the subjective perceptions. Because regarding both sustainability and public transport quality, it's important to understand that it doesn't help if we provide a good quality. It's also an aim in itself to make people feel that we've achieved a good quality. So therefore, in the TSB, you measure both what is actually happening in different fields and how people perceive this. And that's also something that we borrowed into our framework. So what we borrowed into the framework is the measuring philosophy, that we measure progress towards a target, that we use progress indicators, that we use a hierarchy of indicators that sort of indicates this fact that you're doing things at one level, but you really want to achieve things at another level. And also this duality between subjective and objective. And the way we chose to combine it is here, where you recognize the layers we were talking about. We have the system and the process as inputs. We have this quality accessibility level as output, and we have the use as the outcome. And we have all those various exogenous factors that affect, so that we can decide what we do down here, but we have rather limited influence of what is happening up here. So that is why we described this, illustrated this as an upside down pyramid or triangle, showing that there's happening things here. What we're doing here is diluted, so that if you only measure up here, we will not see the effects. We cannot often determine the direct effects of what we did down here. It will be diluted by other factors. And also we have this parallel, so that we have a subjective side and an objective side of this. So we have now tried to fill this framework overall. We have the layers, we have the indicators, we call them ridership, accessibility, connectivity, and cooperation. We have the levels, which is the input level, the output level, and the outcome level. We have the objective and the subjective side. And we can fill that with measurements or suggestions for how do we measure this, how do we describe or capture this. And we found examples in literature of how that could be done, not that these necessarily are the best examples, but it's some good examples. So for example, how do you measure if a process is integrated? There's a suggestion for an indicator in the eco-mobility shift framework. But on the subjective side, it's about asking people whether they perceive the public transport system as one or as separate. On the system level, we have the connectivity measures. There's an interesting paper by Chowdhury et al. Where they measure and describe the connectivity or the quality. They measure in terms of generalized costs, so it's related to how people perceive it. But the thing is, why it's not quality is because it's not related to where people want to go. It's on a stop to stop. It's an aggregate description of the overall quality of, if you look at the travel between one stop to any other stop. If we look at the accessibility level, there are many different suggestions in literature. Personally, I like the log sum a lot, although it's a bit technical, but I like it because it's capturing both where people want to go, but also the availability of other alternatives, which is interesting. And it is a good accessibility measure for that reason. And the subjective correspondent to that may be something about, do you think that public transport provides feasible travel options? And then use can be like passenger kilometers, but it could also be like number of people using a bike share system or so. And the subjective question to that is something about whether they would want to use something that could be called intention rather than real use. So now we've suggested a framework. We've discussed integrated public transport in some theoretical terms, but also tried to make it a bit more concrete with some examples. So what are the advantages of doing this? Well, what we like about what we did is that it sets simple here. I'm sure that you are listening now to all these dimensions and words and things, don't think that it's all that simple. But what we mean is that it's a structured way to discuss. It's more a structured way than a simple way. To talk about integration, to understand all those different things and how they relate to each other. And we provide terminology or suggested terminology, and that we suggest both a subjective and an objective measurement of the different aspects. What we think is still rather difficult is, for example, the fact that we haven't been thinking about a concrete target group, which is a real disadvantage of anything, because we cannot really say that it works, because it should have to work for someone. On the other side, you cannot really criticize us for it not being workable, because that cannot be determined until you discuss which target group. A specific challenge that was there also in the TSB work is what we call the vision problem. The vision problem is that there's that balance. So here we say, you set a vision and you look at progress towards that vision. That's a very good thing. That's why we borrowed it over to this framework. The negative part of that is that if you are not brave, we've been talking here a lot about brave politicians. So if you're not brave, then you will set a near target, an easy to reach target, and it will look so, it doesn't work for benchmarking against other cities, for example, because you will achieve your target because you didn't set a brave vision. Then another challenge or disadvantage is that we've been looking into the specific question of integrated public transport, which is important, but which is just, it's a limited thing. So it is, of course, difficult. If you're looking at integration only, you're talking about an important thing. That's what we've been doing in 2 days, but there are a lot of other things that have influenced public transport standard. I mean, there's the overall amount of resources, the timetable frequency, a lot of things apart from integration. So it is a bit limited to talk about monitoring the integration only. And finally, there's a specific problem that we have here that wasn't there in the sustainability aspect, measurements or monitoring. And that it's really there's no room here for looking at the economic side of things. And that's natural when you look into sustainability, because you have the economic pillar of sustainability. So whether your system is efficient or not, that comes in naturally into that part. But here we're actually talking about the standard, which standard you provide. But we haven't been talking a lot about, or not at all about, the level of resources that you use to achieve that standard. So there's nowhere here in this indicator system where you could show that we do it we provide the same standard for passengers now as we did last year, but we do it for 10% less resources. That's also an improvement, but an improvement that will not show. So if you would want to do something like that, along the lines, then what's there left to do? Well, a lot of things. The first thing is to identify a target group. So who do we provide this information for? What are they supposed to do with that information? And then complete the framework with indicators, of course, the true measurements. Which measurements do we use to describe those different dimensions? How do we visualize it? In the work with the TSB, this was very important. It was very important. It was already from the outset. So it was the final product. How do we present our results was a very important input into the process of how do we formulate our indicators. And then, of course, to all this has to be connected in monitoring plans, so that how do we collect this data, with which regularity, how often do we announce these things, etc.
That was
All right.